The realm. Do you know what the realm is? It's the 1,000 blades of Aegon's enemies. A story we agree to tell each other over and over till we forget that it's a lie.
What's up, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back for another Game of Thrones Season 8 video. In today's video, I want to discuss some of the ways Game of Thrones can improve their amazing show in the final season. As I'm sure most of you know by now, Game of Thrones has been receiving a lot of criticism over the last few seasons, mostly ever since they did surpass the books. This is something that I haven't spent too much time talking about because I really don't consider myself to be a critic. Most of you should know I'm more interested in trying to predict what could happen in the show, instead of trying to pick apart its flaws. But I recently read an article published by Forbes.com and I thought this one was written very well. I believe the person did a good job at not only dissecting the problems with Game of Thrones, but also providing some solutions on how to fix it, which is why I wanted to read it today. So, if you're interested in listening to something like this, let's take a listen to what this person had to say. Let me know if you think their criticisms are fair or not. So with that being said, let's begin. Number 1. Stop thinking like a big TV show and think like a book. If you've read any criticism of the show over the past couple seasons, and especially of Season 7, you likely encountered someone lamenting the fact that the show has now sprinted past the books by George R.R. Martin. There are many reasons to be sad about this, though at least during the mostly excellent 6th season, I was hopeful that at the very least, we'd get a satisfying conclusion to the story. But Season 6, for all its flaws, still felt like the seasons that came before it, and still felt like an adaptation of the books into a TV show. Puzzling aspects aside, the previous season of the show was mostly quite enjoyable, with some truly amazing episodes that felt at home in the universe Martin created, despite not being based on events he had wrote himself. Season 7 stopped feeling like a book adaptation almost out the gates. Some readers were mad at me for focusing on the speed at which characters moved about the giant Westerosi map, but this fast travel was just one symptom of a much larger problem. The TV show had abandoned all the little details that made it once feel like a novel rather than a blockbuster TV action show. Gone were the interesting encounters on the road, or the sense that there was even a road. Now characters could teleport from Winterfell to King's Landing, or Dragonstone to Eastwatch by the Sea in a blink of an eye. Gone too was that sense of tension and vulnerability that made the show and books so devilishly addictive. Now that almost every character in the show has such thick plot armor, even incredibly stupid plans, like going beyond the wall to capture a white, have no consequences. Robb Stark was killed for marrying the wrong woman in the heat of passion and breaking his vow to Lord Frey. But Jon Snow can go face the Night King again, and this time with just a ragtag band of heroes, walk out with most of his team intact. Indeed, almost all the Magnificent Seven survived, though admittedly a dragon was lost. That was one consequence. Alas, the loss felt contrived, given how bad the plan was to begin with. The biggest death of the season was arguably that of Peter Littlefinger Baelish, the mastermind who orchestrated almost all the chaos that's overcome the major houses of Westeros. He died getting tricked by the Stark children in a plot that made about as much sense as your average episode of The Walking Dead. The entire sequence was easily the worst in the entire run of Game of Thrones, and made every character involved worse. All of this is to say that the show ditched its commitment to carefully plotted characters and carefully constructed world in favor of your usual TV tropes and reliance on big action sequences, crazy CGI, and a flat, if long-awaited, romance between Jon Snow and Daenerys. So what should the show do in Season 8? Probably the first and most important thing I can suggest is that the writers simply consider the audience. The audience for this show is here precisely because the show has, up to this point, cared deeply about the qualities that made it great to begin with. We don't want stupid Littlefinger getting duped in a stupid plot. If there's going to be an element of intrigue, it has to be as good or better than those that came before. What we got felt like amateur hour. Think like a book, not a TV show. Give yourself the time with each story that each story deserves, even if that means extending the final season beyond 6 episodes. Face it, Season 7 felt rushed to the point that where the show was an insult to both its viewers and the source material. I understand wanting to wrap things up, but let's do it with the respect for the story that it deserves, even if that means fleshing out the current scripts and extending the final season. Number 2. Remember that even though this is an epic clash between good and evil, Game of Thrones isn't just epic fantasy. This moves us along to our next point. As much as Game of Thrones has always been a drama with elements of action, the books were always gritty medieval fantasy based on historical conflicts and rooted in a sense of realism. What the show has become is high, epic fantasy with fire-breathing dragons and evil undead armies led by wicked, magical kings. This would be fine if the rules of the earlier show or books still applied. For instance, if we had characters still acting like themselves and who paid the price of their poor decisions with some kind of consequence, transitioning from gritty realism to high fantasy might work. A Song of Ice and Fire was always something of a deconstruction of the fantasy genre, yet it's largely been moving toward the same broad strokes endgame as the show. A conflict between the others north of the Wall and their army of the dead, and the forces of the living, including Dany and her dragons. That's going to be high fantasy no matter what, but one suspects that if the books are ever finished, the high fantasy tropes that accompany a confrontation between a Dark Lord and a chosen hero will be subverted and deconstructed in some way. After Season 7 of the show, I have less hope that HBO's adaptation will be as interesting or as bold. Still, Season 8 could get back on the show's earlier sense of grim realism even while the final showdown between good and evil takes place. There are plenty of fan theories that suggest the Night King may be one of our heroes, or that there might be some terrible betrayals in store for our favorite characters. If handled properly, these ideas could result in a show that still surprises us. But I think these big twists and reveals and betrayals still feel too gotcha for a story such as this. Rather, I'd like to see the characters' natural tendencies serve to both undermine them and surprise us in more natural, less big twist, big prophecy ways. Looking back on Robb Stark's character arc, his downfall was never because of some prophecy or because he was special in any way. He didn't need to be the true heir to the Iron Throne or the Mother of Dragons. He was Ned's son, taking up arms to save and then to avenge his father. And he died because he was foolish and horny and romantic and young. Oberyn Martell died because he liked the sound of his own voice too much and he underestimated his opponent. The show and the books were always better when they dealt with normal people in exceptional circumstances either overcoming their obstacles or being crushed by them. That should not change now just because we're at the endgame. Number 3. Don't ignore the world building. Just because we're at the endgame doesn't mean that the world building should suffer, but it has. This is partly due to the aforementioned fast traveling, which robs viewers of most of the show's best moments, which almost all take place on the way to and from places. Context is important, and when Westeros feels like a big, huge, dangerous place, it felt real. Now it feels like the size and scope of the world have become diminished to something much smaller and safer and less interesting. Or take High Garden, referred to as one of the richest and most beautiful cities in all of the Seven Kingdoms. The show gave us quite literally the least interesting, least beautiful castle we've seen so far. Or take Dorne. Its leaders were killed in Season 7, but the show seems to think that that would mean no other leaders exist in Sunspear. It's a prosperous land, and the only in the Seven Kingdoms where its leader could be called Prince rather than Lord. Many thousands of spears stand ready and waiting to aid Daenerys, because House Martell and House Targaryen have a long friendship. Yet the show simply wipes the entire region off the map with Ellaria and the Sand Snakes' deaths or imprisonments. All of this diminishes the world that both the show and author have so painstakingly created. They've done this before, as I pointed out with the Dornish coup, but also in how they've treated other characters' deaths. The monumentally terrible death of Sir Barristan Selmy was another moment that diminished the world, and so was the pointless reintroduction and murder of Osha and Rickon. But it's gotten so much worse in Season 7. When it comes to the 8th season, I urge the show's writers, producers, and directors to never forget how important world building is to a story like this. Don't gloss over the small details. Don't forget about the rules already in place. Don't ignore entire regions in order to expedite the storytelling. These things are what make the show not merely good, but truly great. Oh, and give us Ghost. Ghost is more important to the story than the showrunners seem to believe. Number 4. Don't expect the audience to be okay with gaping plot holes. Thrones fans are smarter than the average bear. Expectations matter. Who your audience is matters. I truly never expected Game of Thrones to ever remind me of The Walking Dead, but Season 7 was a whole different story. The fake-out subplot in Winterfell was just incredibly cheap. It was weak writing, plain and simple. That was less about telling a good story and more about fooling the audience. Well, the audience rarely likes to be fooled, at least in such a cheap way. Or take Euron Greyjoy's magical fleet. 1,000 ships miraculously built in just months that can zip around Westeros at great speed and never fail in battle. Their plan to go and catch a white beyond the wall was quite obviously very stupid, and simple alternatives presented themselves to just about anyone who took the time to come up with them. Likewise, the speed of the Ravens and Gendry and Daenerys was called into question, not because there's no possible way that this could have worked on screen, but because it was so loosely thrown together. It felt incredibly lazy, and the discerning viewership of Game of Thrones felt insulted by it. In Season 8, the showrunners need to make absolutely sure that 3 things happen. Characters must act in character at all times, and suffer the consequences of their actions, both good and bad. Time and distance has to be accounted for and conveyed, even if it isn't a major part of the story. Stories cannot exist merely to move the plot forward or to trick the audience. They have to flow organically from the characters. If the writers stick to these concepts, we should be fine in Season 8. No more cheap tricks, and no more inexplicably stupid moves on Tyrion's part, and at least some nod to the distance traveled and the time passing. This last thing can be achieved easily through snippets of dialogue and a bit more runtime rather than such abbreviated seasons. Number 5. Read over the dialogue a few more times before you film it. A mind needs a book as a sword needs a whetstone, if it's to keep its edge. Never forget what you are, for surely the world will not. Make it your strength, then it can never be your weakness. Armor yourself in it, and it will never be used to hurt you. The things that we love destroy us every time, lad. Remember that. What is honor compared to a woman's love? What is duty against the feel of a newborn son in your arms, or the memories of a brother's smile? Wind in words, wind in words. We are only human, and the gods have fashioned us for love. That is our great glory, and our great tragedy. These are all lines from Martin's books, if you hadn't guessed already. They are, at times, peppered into the show as well. It's why the dialogue is often so good in this show. It has such great source material. But I don't accept that Martin was the only reason the show had good dialogue in its earlier seasons. There were scenes as far back as Season 1 that never took place in the books, that were incredibly well written, with dialogue that fit beautifully alongside Martin's. But Season 7 all but abandoned even a pretense of actually caring about dialogue. Jon Snow delivered the same speech countless times. When we learned of the prophecy of Azor Ahai, we were literally clubbed over the head with the fact that it could be referring to a man or a woman. Tyrion seems to have lost his wit entirely, and Littlefinger, of course, well, you get the picture. Take some time with Season 8. Give us dialogue that's every bit as interesting as the story once was. This might be a show about fire-breathing dragons, but that's never been the point. This is a show about interesting, conflicted, complicated characters interacting with one another, more often with words than with blades. I'd say a story needs words like a sword needs a whetstone, if it's to keep its edge. Alright, so let me know what you think about what that person had to say. Do you agree that these things could help fix the show in the final season, or do you believe that the show is just fine the way it is? In my opinion, I pretty much agree with everything that was said in the article. As much as I do love the show, I can't deny the fact that the overall quality of the story has suffered since they went off course of the books. Now don't get me wrong, Game of Thrones still operates like a high quality show. The costumes, the cinematography, the action sequences, the CGI, and the score are all still amazing. However, the writing and the pacing has definitely suffered, especially during the last season. I think one of their biggest mistakes was trying to shorten each season. I mean, I understand why they did it, because it does allow them to be more flexible with their budget, but I also feel like this has cut the legs out from underneath the show. But regardless of what people think about the previous seasons, I am still holding out hope for the final season. I do have faith that they can deliver something satisfying for the viewers, but I also highly recommend that the producers and the writers of the show take some advice from some of the criticism they have received. It's never too late to turn everything back around, and I do hope that they can fix some of the issues by making each episode a little bit longer in length, which they did say they were planning to do. Leave your thoughts down below in the comments section. Let me know what you think they can do to make Game of Thrones great again. Anyways, I hope everyone has a great day, and for those of you that celebrate the holidays, I want to wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year's. Thanks again, everyone. I will see you again very soon. Bye.